Since I know this video is going to be long, I'm just going to speedrun the intro. Ross Gottman from Accursed Farm was able to kickstart an initiative for EU citizens with the goal of legally requiring video game publishers to leave live service games in a playable state even after they're no longer supported. For this to be pushed, we will need 1 million signatures, which although is a lot, quite a lot actually, even I don't have the biggest amount of confidence in this initiative. It is worth noting that we've already reached 200,000 signatures, and the deadline is July 31st, 2025, so we still have some time to collect signatures. Now, although this campaign has received quite a bit of support, not everyone shares positive sentiment. Thor from Private Software made 2 videos highlighting why he doesn't agree with this initiative. Now, I'm just gonna say it up front that Pirate Video's first video was pretty bad. I think a lot of it was diversion and making excuses for why the initiative wouldn't work, with points that have already been addressed by the FAQ. However, in his second video, while I also think he's making excuses, I think there are much more interesting points to address. Now, to start off, I feel like I should establish the foundation for a lot of his points because I do believe that Thor points out something that's completely true. You see, a lot of live service games are not entirely run through the client, as in the video game console or PC that they're installed on. Many of them have a client server model in which much of the tasks and processes are done essentially on another computer, as in the cloud host. So it's not like you can just patch an offline mode and suddenly the game runs no problem. It's not that simple. The game would require some serious revamping of its infrastructure, which could either be impossible or incredibly difficult. And you might be thinking, well, why did they design the game that way in the first place? Aren't they at fault for making the game so reliant on their dedicated servers? Well, you can view it that way, but I think there are legitimate reasons for why the game could be designed this way. Aside from security, which, based on what we've seen from GTA 5 with its archaic peer-to-peer netcode, I think we can all agree that there can be benefits from the game's online being hosted on dedicated servers, in which they can better encrypt data and apply anti-cheating measures to prevent people from abusing their network. Listen, it's the design philosophy the developer shows, I don't agree with it, but it is what it is, I guess. And in all honesty, I don't even necessarily have a major issue with that. I don't think every developer should be forced to revamp the code base to make the game run fully locally. However, if they are gonna leave the game in this state even after it's shut down, I do on the other hand believe that they should first patch the game to allow you to host it with your own servers, and following this, do one of the 2 things. A. Provide documentation for how you can build your own server emulator, or they can develop the server emulator themselves and distribute to the public. Of course, they would also have to shut down the in-game store, and there may even be some temporary events that won't get preserved depending on how ingrained it is to the present build of the game. But being able to access a functional version of the game without relying on the developers maintaining the servers is more than enough. Now, Pirate Software brought up a point that I actually had some time to think about, which is regarding the monetization of the game. In essence, if the publishers are legally required to provide tools or documentation for building a server emulator, are the people who host the servers allowed to monetize the game? Now, given how the in-game store would have to be disabled because, well, it has to. There's no payment tool that can be built into and maintained by the developer since they're no longer accepting payments. And we're certainly not going to allow the community to implement their own payment tool. There are so many security and possibly legal concerns for us to even address, so it should just be flat out disabled. So I have to assume that he's referring to things such as Patreon and other forms of exclusive access to certain community servers that the host maintainers can choose to monetize. Now, at first I was a little bit confused as to why this is a possibility that people would even bring up, but after careful consideration, I'm starting to kind of understand what scenario this would apply to. Realistically, hosting the servers to keep the live service game up, especially the kinds of big, long-scale games that we tend to see, would definitely be expensive, 100%. This is not something that any Joe Schmo would be able to keep up without any kind of financial backing, at least not to a point where the game could be sustained to the same level of reliability that we got when the gaming companies were still supporting the game. So in these scenarios, a donation system would likely be necessary in order to have an active and reasonably reliable community. So the question becomes, should these community host servers allowed to be monetized? Because Thor did bring up a good point, which is that certain games, particularly on the indie side, could become victims of targeted DDoS attacks with the sole purpose of hijacking their servers by forcing them to shut down due to constant targeted attacks, and then once they're inevitably forced to give away documentation to host community servers, those same bad actors can take advantage of that and monetize the game through something like Patreon or other forms of donation system. Now, I personally have my doubts regarding how often that would actually happen, simply because I don't think there are that many groups of people who would find it to be worth hijacking a live service for the sole purpose of monetization, since they wouldn't have the same branding as the original developers, and depending on how resourceful they are, they probably wouldn't be able to provide as much polished support as the original developers, to the point where even the few people who signed up to these community hosted servers would just inevitably lose interest. So I really don't think this would be a bankable enough strategy that you would see that many people doing it, but I do think that's a legitimate concern. And my answer to that question is that I do not think that communities should have the right to monetize their servers. The reason for why I'm saying this is that at the end of the day, we're not asking the developers to sacrifice the full rights to their IP, which would include the right to exclusively monetize it. We need to understand that when a game is no longer being sold or supported, that doesn't mean the publisher no longer has the rights to the IP. Copyright and trademarks are very persistent, long-lasting intellectual properties that don't expire overnight. Like, think of it from this perspective. When you buy a DVD or Blu-ray, if you actually read the terms and conditions, you will learn that the end user actually has restrictions on how widely they can broadcast the movie. So if I buy Spider-Man 1 as an example, and decide to stream the movie with a projector on a rented venue and charge people to watch it, that would not only be illegal, Sony Pictures Entertainment, if they wanted, they can absolutely sue my ass, because in the end, when I bought Spider-Man 1, I merely bought the license to watch the movie. I wasn't granted the full intellectual rights to the movie. Now granted, I still own the disc and they can't take that away from me, but they can definitely prevent me from either redistributing it or monetizing through broadcasting the movie without their permission. The same would be true for live services that provide server emulators. We're not asking for the right to make money off of the game. We just simply want to play the game that we paid for. And yes, if there are people out there that directly or indirectly make money off of the game by hosting community servers, the companies should have the right to sue them. Of course, I'm mostly speaking from a legal viewpoint. Morally, it's a bit of a different story, to be honest. I would find it kind of shitty if a gaming company decided to go after a team trying to pay the bills for reviving the game that you decided to kill off support for, but legally, I do believe they should have that right. And yes, that would cause some inconveniences. Communities would have a harder time hosting stable servers. We would probably never truly revive the experience we used to have when the game publisher was still supporting it. But at the end of the day, that is still better than nothing. And yes, I'm sure it will be annoying for developers who will have to hire legal teams and constantly be on the lookout for people trying to monetize their community servers. But at the end of the day, that's what video game developers are already doing. People violate IP laws all the time. There are people out there uploading pirated copies of video games and making money through invasive ads, selling fast bandwidth, probably selling your browser data to shady data brokers. These things happen whether it's an old or new game. It sucks, it's not in my intention to see video game companies getting their rights violated, but that doesn't mean I want my consumer rights to be violated too. I'm sorry, here in the European Union, we have established firm consumer rights, including the right of property, we have the Unfair Contract Terms Directive. I have no issues with gaming companies protecting their intellectual rights of excluding people from monetizing off of their copyrighted work by going against the people violating their rights. But in my case as a consumer, I'm protecting my own rights as the proprietor of the product that I purchased, and the people violating those rights are the gaming companies. So I'm sure I'm probably in direct conflict with some developers, but I genuinely don't care. You made a game that has an expiration date, and the people that determine that expiration date are the publishers. How is that fair? Like, my copy of Sakura Wars also has an expiration date. I'm sure it'll probably experience disc rot at some point in the future. But that wasn't the developer that chose its fate, it was just simply natural causes. And even then, I would argue that it's probably gonna last longer than 99% of live service out there. That's the difference between a game that I own and a game that I don't own. And I wouldn't have an issue if, for example, the way I experience these live service games was through a subscription, because in that case, I'm actually paying for a service. I'm not purchasing a product that I'm supposedly meant to own indefinitely. I know what the expiration date is, and I signed into it knowing what I was getting into. But many live service games will do one of two things. A. Sell in-game items that you pay upfront with the expectation that you're meant to own it, or, even worse, you pay full price for the game. You know, people like to say, well, when you buy a game, usually in reference to online digital stores, you don't truly own it anyway. You're only paying for a license to play it. But here's the thing, when I bought Soccer Wars, I also paid for a license to play it. The difference here is that the gaming company can't do anything to revoke that license from me. Why? Because the disc is mine. I paid for it, it's my property. So fuck you, get the hell away from my game. But with live service games, I'm the one getting fucked, even though I paid for it. That's why this law needs to get passed. And you know, you might say, well, if you don't like this business model, then don't play live service games. As a matter of fact, I don't play them. For a long time, I've been saying that I'm primarily a single player guy, because I don't want to fucking deal with this shit. But here's the problem with this argument. A couple of years ago, Apple decided to remove the audio jack from their iPhones. Everyone laughed at Apple, even Samsung took jabs at Apple. Yet here we are, 2024, and most expensive phones out there don't have an audio jack. Because you see, boycotting doesn't really work when the thing you're boycotting is successful. Because you might be able to get away with not supporting certain companies and business practices by avoiding them entirely, and I have nothing against that. I've never had an issue with anyone boycotting, and I would encourage you to do it. But the problem here is, it's only a matter of time before other companies start doing the same thing. And the live service business model has impacted me directly. I'm someone that plays a lot of anime games, and unfortunately in the past couple of years, many of them have pretty much become live service gacha games. I can't avoid that. I want to play more Love Live games. I don't want to play dozens of mobile bullshit. I love Blue Reflection. The latest entry in the series is a fucking gacha game that's already shut down after less than 2 years. This is already bleeding through the sector of the industry that I care about. Do you know how painful it was to see Blue Reflection devolve into gacha shit? But that's what the live service model encourages, and I knew this would die out pretty quickly. I knew it wouldn't go anywhere. I knew there were probably a lot of people who would just waste time and money there, and now they can't access the game anymore. Again, this happened in less than 2 years. But you know what I can play? Blue Reflection Second Light, which is what I've been playing recently on both my Steam Deck and my Linux gaming PC. And to be honest, much of this wouldn't be an issue if the gaming companies did the following things. Firstly, if they had a more honest form of monetization, as in making it an actual subscription service which would fit the definition of a live service. You support them financially by paying for their service. But instead, video game companies choose to have a much more predatory business model. They sell things such as battle passes, microtransactions, gacha tickets, all things that take advantage of our primal addictive urges. When you have systems like daily objectives, stamina bars, exclusive events, all things that are designed to create time constraints for you, and in many instances, pressuring you into paying for their in-game content in order to catch up. That's honestly one of the main reasons for why it's hard for me to feel bad for the developers, because I just feel like a lot of these business practices are inherently malicious. As annoying as character DLCs, map packs, and season passes may be, I would be much more willing to accept all of those things over what a lot of these live service games often do, because in those examples, you can still access that content offline. To some degree. There are still issues with key ownership requiring online authentication, but even then, I feel like a lot of that would still be easy to patch into working offline if they were forced to do that, which I actually do believe they should, or at the very least offer an easy, accessible migration process if the platform hosting the digital keys have been shut down. Kind of like when Google shut down their Google Play Music service and they offer a way to migrate your library into YouTube Music. Solutions like that, I don't have a problem with, but we all know live service games are never gonna fucking do something like that. So until then, give us a server emulator. The second thing I wanted to bring up, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, a lot of live service games wouldn't even be in the position that they're in right now if they just let us play their games locally. That, I feel like, is the root of many of these problems. It's the fact that these gaming companies don't want to let us pull the Ethernet cable. They want us to constantly be connected to their online servers. And I think right now, they feel completely comfortable doing that because they know they can get away with not taking any responsibility when they shut down their servers. Well, with this law, they have to take responsibility. And if there are gaming companies out there that will cry about this law being too cumbersome for them, then maybe you shouldn't be making games. I'm sorry if that sounds harsh, but I'm being serious. If you are a gaming company, especially one that is backed up by billion-dollar publishers, if you are incapable of having an end-of-life plan for allowing your player base that you pretend to care about to continue playing your game that they spent money on, you are either too fucking incompetent or you're insensitive to the concept of basic consumer ownership. Regardless of what the reason may be, you shouldn't be making games, certainly not live service games, if this is the type of whiny attitude that you will have. When Apple was forced to comply with EU demands, they changed their charging port to USB-C. They opened up their operating systems for running apps outside of the store. That's what happens when tech companies have to comply with laws. And I don't even think that what we're asking here is even that unreasonable, because it's already something that happens. There have been games that launch a patch to make the game work offline, like Gran Turismo Sport. There have been end-of-life games where the community found a way to run private servers, like Need for Speed World. This is not a crazy, unfounded concept. It's feasible. Developers just don't want to do it because they don't think they have to. Now, before I end this video, I want to address some minor points that Thor made.
Some people have said, well, simply don't allow monetization of the server. Well, who's going to enforce that? If you want a government initiative to enforce that, that means the government has to build a registry of all of those games and all of that intellectual property that shouldn't be monetized, and then somehow enforce that with no one owning it because those studios have shut down.
Just because the studio gets shut down, it doesn't mean that no one owns the IP anymore. The intellectual rights would either go to the publisher, and in case it was self-published, then it would mostly just depend on what terms was agreed when the legal document was formed. Maybe the rights will go to the original creator, maybe it will go to the stakeholders, maybe it was never properly established, which would require a few court hearings. The point is, the IP doesn't just become public domain. The government wouldn't need to enforce anything that isn't already currently established because the rights holders would have just as much of a right to take down anyone violating their intellectual property.
And for those of you out there that say, oh, this can be done right now, I could just destroy your studio and take your stuff anyway. You could, but this allows a route for it to be legal to do so.
No, it would not. Denial of service attacks are still illegal. You can go to jail for that.
So, in the most extreme, people said live service games shouldn't exist at all, and the initiative will kill them off for good, and that's a good thing. Well, you don't get to define what players get to play or not play. You also shouldn't be able to get to define what developers build or don't build. You should not have creative control over the developers, and you should not have control over what is in my Steam library or on my phone.
Now this I actually do agree with. As much as I don't like live service games, I wouldn't say that they shouldn't exist. If there's demand for it, they should be allowed to exist in the market, and it's not my goal for them to just completely die out. I will say though that if this initiative makes developers less incentivized to develop live service games, my only response to that is, well, if you're that type of person that feels comfortable selling a game that consumers don't own, not to mention the idea of an end-of-life plan to allow players to access the game that they paid for is something that you can't envision doing for whichever excuses you want to give, then you probably shouldn't be making live service games in the first place.
So the next one is that this is about games preservation, and that it needs to happen to preserve these types of games for future generations and for everyone to always have forever.
I actually don't come from that angle necessarily. My main concern is ownership. Now, ownership can and usually does overlap with the concept of preservation, but I've said this before in the past. Preservation in and of itself isn't necessarily what's at risk. In theory, a lot of games that are delisted are probably being preserved even by the developers. I wouldn't expect them to just discard their old game data once they're no longer selling it. They probably have an archive of it somewhere in their digital vault. My main issue is when people purchase something and they can't access it anymore. And yes, with live service games, you're never gonna fully preserve the experience that you had. For example, if you had a profile with beefed up stats and everything, you're probably gonna lose it. I doubt you'll be able to recover that unless it's being held on some proxy server that hasn't been shut down. But honestly, if it was a game that I really cared about, I would be willing to spend my own power and internet to host a small little server in order for me to access the game a few times when I feel like it. The last thing I do want to share is my own personal opinion as far as which live service games I actually believe shouldn't be required to leave the game in a functional state after it's shut down. This isn't me expressing the beliefs of the initiative, this is just my personal assessment. Number 1. Games that are playable offline with no microtransactions. An example of this would be Storm Connections. Game has no microtransactions, primarily makes money through game sales and season passes, and the game is fully functional offline, so this is pretty much the ideal scenario. If they want to shut down their online, I don't think they should be legally required to provide a server emulator. Now, there are other legal requirements that I do believe they should meet, but I would say that's mostly on the part of the platform that hosts these games, namely Sony, Microsoft, and Valve, mainly when they decide to shut down the store, making the DLC content potentially inaccessible. Number 2. Subscription-based live service games. This can fall into two categories. A game that is quite literally inaccessible without paying for a subscription, or it's a free-to-play game that has some additional subscription offers that offer some boosters. Now, even then, that last scenario is very murky because if the boosters in questions involve items that can already be purchased alternatively through their in-game store, then I do think they should be required to provide a server emulator because they're selling a product inside the game. But if they're not doing that, then I don't think they should provide one. But anyway, I think that's all I have to share. I'm really liking the direction of the Stop Killing Games campaign, and I intend to support it along the way. And that's all I really have to share. Take care.